Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Craig Hansen from the World Resources Institute. Welcome to our session on a pathway to carbon neutral agriculture in Denmark. I'm going to wait for a few more seconds as people enter the virtual auditorium here. So just bear with me for a moment. The numbers of participants continues to climb. So we'll wait a few more seconds before we get going. Please take your seat virtually. Great. We're starting to hit plateau here. Again, my name is Craig Hansen. I'm a vice president at the World Resources Institute. I oversee our work on food, forest, water, and the ocean. And I want to welcome you all to today's webinar on a pathway to carbon neutral agriculture in Denmark. As I mentioned, I'm with the World Resources Institute, and in the year 2019, WRI, along with the World Bank, United Nations Environment Program, United Nations Development Program, and two French-based research organizations, INRA and CIRAD, published a major world resources report focused on food. This report, called Creating a Sustainable Food Future, asked the question, how is the world going to feed nearly 10 billion people by the year 2050 in a manner that advances economic development and food security while also reducing impacts on the environment, water, biodiversity, climate? In creating a sustainable food future, we identified three big gaps. First is the food gap. Business as usual projections from 2010 to 2050 show the world's going to demand at least 50% more food by the year 2050. There's a land gap. Business as usual projections would be that the world would convert another 600 million hectares, that's twice the size of India, of natural ecosystems converted into agriculture, croplands and pasture lands to feed the planet. And thirdly, there's a greenhouse gas emissions gap. Under business as usual, emissions from agriculture and associated land use change would climb to 15 gigatons of CO2 equivalent by the year 2050, when, according to the Paris Agreement and all the IPCC reports, we need to be getting down to at least 4 gigatons for a 2-degree world and down to 0 or lower for a 1.5-degree world. Now, to address those gaps, we proposed a 5-course menu of solutions. Number one, reduce projected growth in demand, things like shifting diets, food loss and waste reduction. Number two, boosting yields on existing croplands and pastures to sustainably boost production while avoiding the need for land conversion. Number three was reduce emissions from production of agriculture, methane from cattle and rice, on-farm energy, and other sources of emissions. Fourth was to improve sustainability of fisheries. And fifth was, with the liberated land, if we do the things above, right, we could actually start implementing restoration, especially back into forests, of marginal lands or restoring degraded peatlands where possible, given the other menu items that we pursued. Now, that report was global in scope. So the next question we asked is, what does this menu look like at the national level? And this week, WRI released a report that does just that. We applied that menu to a country, in this case, Denmark. And today, you're going to hear from WRI's Tim Sertinger, who was the lead author of Creating a Sustainable Food Future and is now the lead author of A Pathway to Carbon Neutral Agriculture in Denmark, who's going to share the findings of what it looked like when we applied that menu to Denmark. We'll then hear from a panel of experts who will share Danish perspectives on the report's findings, as well as how to apply this approach to other advanced agricultural economies who are grappling with how to cut emissions in order to hit these critical climate targets. You all, my audience, will have a chance to ask questions of experts as they dive into this. Just go to the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen and type in questions, and the latter half of this presentation, of this webinar, we'll get into that. We're recording this webinar. It will be available at WRI's website afterwards. Now let's turn to our speakers. I'm pleased to welcome Tim Sertinger, who's a research scholar at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, as well as a senior fellow at WRI. He's been an author of numerous publications in top scientific journals related to land use, climate change, and agriculture. Welcome. I'd also like to welcome Søren Søndergaard, who is a farmer and chairman of the leading farmer organization in Denmark, the Danish Agriculture and Food Council. Likewise, welcome today Maria Rumer Gjerding, who is the president of the largest conservation organization in Denmark, the Danish Society for Nature Conservation. And finally, I'd like to welcome Charles Godfrey, who is the director of the Oxford Martin School at the University of Oxford. Now, with that, let me turn over to the show. First of all, Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And let me make sure everyone can see my screen. hold on. And let's see, is this going to work? Oh boy. There we are. Okay. So, hold on, slideshow from current slide. Can you all see my slide? So what you should be seeing are the words produce, protect, reduce, and restore. So the summary of our global report was essentially that you needed the following strategies in order to feed the world. You need to produce more food on the same land. You need to make sure that that is used to protect habitat. You need to reduce emissions and reduce consumption of things that require a lot of land. And then if we can do all of that successfully, we can restore a habitat and mitigate remaining emissions. And I want to emphasize a little bit some of the categories here. So if we tried to produce all the food, all that extra 50% more food in 2050 with today's farms, greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture would rise from about 12 gigatons, 12 billion tons, which is about 25% of global emissions, to 38 billion tons. And that by itself would overwhelm the world's greenhouse gas targets. That would also include deforesting most of the temperate forests and tropical forests of the world. So built into even our, what we call our baseline, our prediction of 15 billion tons was continued ongoing yield gains in crops and livestock production, that without which you would have had that terrible target of 38 billion tons. So this is a critical part of all the strategies. Once you reached our baseline, then we had strategies for reducing consumption, including holding down meat, milk consumption, reducing food loss and waste, avoiding dedicating land to biofuels, more productivity gains, and then a range of practices to reduce production emissions. And we eventually get a target close to our target of 4 billion tons. And if we can then restore more habitat, we can then offset those. So we wanted to apply that same concept to Denmark. So Danish agriculture, Denmark is a highly intensive agricultural country. It's 62% of Danish agriculture, of Danish land. It's basically in the pork and dairy business and exports 90% of the pork, half of the dairy. It's probably about 25% of Denmark's greenhouse gas emissions. And even though it's only about 1.5% of Danish economy, maybe 3% if you include all the other things that go along with agriculture. And because of that, you could argue, well, look, the best way for Denmark to solve its climate obligations is simply to reduce or even get rid of Danish agriculture. But the problem is that would just transfer milk production or the food production abroad, and that can't be a global solution. So one thing we do recommend is that Denmark try to reduce its meat and milk consumption. And Denmark consumes a staggering amount of milk and meat, more than 1,300 kilocalories per day. And all solutions require reduction in milk and meat by the world's largest consumers. But that doesn't mean that Denmark should reduce its production. And we know that in the context, in the non-food context. We know that solving climate change requires that people drive less, but it also requires that we make more efficient cars. And simply closing down the car factories in one country is not a good strategy to persuade people to drive less. So we need both strategies to reduce consumption and to produce things more efficiently, produce, protect, and reduce. And here's a sobering reality of the future we face. This is a slide that we had in our main report and in our new report, and I'm going to explain it a little bit. The vertical side is the per capita, the per person consumption of all animal products. And the horizontal is the size of the population in 2050. And what you see from that is that in 2050, if you go up to here, more than 6 billion people are going to live in countries that today consume around on average, around 200 calories of milk and meat per day. That's it. By contrast, in the US and Europe, it's about 800 calories of milk and meat, and Denmark is 1,300, which tells you why Denmark should reduce its consumption. And we want these countries to try to reduce their consumption. But even if they were to cut their consumption in half, all that does is create a little bit of more space for these countries to consume more. And even if they cut their consumption in half, you still have a vast increase in global milk and meat consumption, even if the rest of the world consumes half or even a quarter. So we think realistically, while we want to reduce milk and meat consumption, we're going to need to produce a lot more. And particularly, we want to focus consumption strategies on reducing beef, because beef has about 5 times the emissions of milk, 8 to 10 times the emissions of pork and poultry, and uses vastly more land. And also in Denmark, Denmark is an efficient producer of milk and pork. It's not that different from other advanced countries, so it needs to do a lot more to get lower, but it generally suggests, and we've found, that just shifting production abroad would probably increase emissions somewhat. Okay, so what do we do to Denmark about Denmark's emissions? So Denmark emits about 17.4 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions from the production process. And I'll summarize the 4 basic categories. One is drained peatlands. When you drain peatlands, these are carbon-rich soils. They break down and give up their carbon. The second biggest category is basically cow births, a little bit from pigs too, the methane that comes out of that. A third is all the issues related to nitrogen use in agriculture for cropping. And the fourth is manure management. There's also some energy use. And we also count the emissions from producing feed, which is primarily soybeans imported into Denmark. But then there's a credit for some of the bioenergy from crop residues and from soil carbon gains. Denmark also, there's something that we call a hidden cost, or Denmark's land carbon footprint. And that is the amount of carbon that's lost from all the land used to produce food in Denmark, in a kind of a way that we annualize that I won't go into in detail. And that's actually much bigger. And the imported feed occupies land. We can't get rid of this. This is the cost of having agricultural land instead of forests, for example. But we don't want to increase that. We want to freeze the land carbon footprint. So here's to make the challenge even bigger. Right now, we readjusted our calculations from 2017 to 2050. The world is going to need 45% more food. And mathematically, if we're going to produce 45% more food without clearing more forests and other land, we need 45% more food per hectare. And that means that every hectare in the world, on average, has to do that. And we think that to be land area carbon neutral, it's not enough just to not expand yourself. You have to avoid contributing indirectly to global deforestation. And that means, on average, Denmark, like other countries, should increase its output per hectare by 45%. Okay, so that makes it an even bigger challenge. So one thing you can do is restore peatlands. Denmark has extensive areas of drained peatlands that give up a lot of carbon. We looked at whether or not replacing the food abroad would cancel out those benefits. And no, and basically there's so much carbon that comes off of drained peatlands that we should re-wet them everywhere we can. And we presume that Denmark, or we project that Denmark should restore 85% of its peatlands, 140,000 hectares, and that will offset 95% of the emissions by targeting that correctly. Another thing that's important is just to continue to make progress in the feed efficiency. So we can there are cows that produce more milk for each kilogram of feed. Pigs, there are ways to do that humanely. We projected that if essentially you could achieve the highest performance of the best cows in Denmark on average, about the average cows, we could have enormous gains. And I'll talk a little about some of the ways of doing that. One is to breed cows specifically so that they are efficient in that conversion process. But doing that reduces land use. It reduces all other categories of emissions by quite a lot. What about dealing with the cow burps? Well, there are 2 likely feed additives that should work. One is something that's probably going to be approved this year, made by a Dutch company, DSM, called 3NOT, and another is red algae. And a key theme in our report is the need to advance technology rapidly. And this is a good example. We've known about red algae for 12 years. There are only 2 or 3 labs in the whole world doing experiments with them. And a lot of the most interesting results came just in the last 18 months. And what they've been finding are huge reductions in methane, but amazingly also suggesting that there could be large gains in feed conversion efficiency. In other words, you could feed cows significantly less feed and save all that land, as well as reduce the methane. However, in order to do this, because there are some potential gases that are emitted that are potentially harmful, these need to be produced in a factory, in a closed loop factory, to be able to trap those gases. We now think this can be economical if you have these feed conversion benefits. Nitrogen, so in half of the, Denmark only takes half of the nitrogen applied to farm fields and turns it into crops, and that's common in the world. We need to dramatically improve that, but nitrogen causes greenhouse gas emissions in a wide variety of ways: fertilizer, manure, the internal cycling of nitrogen within soils, leaching of nitrogen to water, and we need to deal with all of those different types of things. And again, we think there are technologies that can help. One is to wait to apply your fertilizer until weeks after they start growing, when you can then sense how much nitrogen has come out of the soils, and which varies from year to year. And because it varies from year to year, farmers can't rely on it. But if you know how much you did, you can apply less, maybe by even 30% less nitrogen. This is a very exciting option by a company called Additives. There's a researcher in England who spent his whole life trying to figure out how the bacterium that helps sugarcane fix its own nitrogen, so it doesn't need a fertilizer or as much fertilizer, can work with other crops. So as you know, beans and other legumes fix their own nitrogen, which means you avoid fertilizer. It means you have a lot less nitrous oxide. And he's identified one variety of this bacterium that gets into virtually all other crops, gets right into the leaf next to the chloroplast, and looks like it can supply 25% of the nitrogen and boost yields at the same time. There are some good results coming in this, but this needs to be further explored and demonstrated. One thing you need to do is keep nitrogen from turning into nitrous oxide. And there's a process that is driven by microorganisms in the soil that turns nitrogen, usually in the form of ammonium, into nitrate. The breakdown of nitrate causes nitrous oxide. And there are synthetic chemicals that will bind to the enzymes that cause that and stop that. They can be quite effective. They tend not to last very long, but they can be coated so they can last longer. And we think there's a huge potential benefit there. Even more benefit over the long term is that there are plants that will secrete their own proteins that block this process. This was discovered on a grass grown in Latin America, a lot originally African, Brachyara humidicola. And there is success now in breeding that property into wheat and other crops, not with genetic engineering, but just by crossing wheat with wild varieties of wheat. This has huge prospects. And one of the potential benefits is there is a good reason to believe that if this works and we select the right variety of wheats, we can have large yield gains by combining some more ammonium with nitrate. This gets quite technical. Cover crops are also important. They're practiced a lot in Denmark. The key here is to develop cover crops that you can plant in the spring, start to grow even as the main crop stops growing, and are therefore ready to grow abundantly and can grow abundantly immediately as you harvest the main crop. And so the issue there is not just to practice this, but to advance this. What about manure? So manure causes nitrous oxide and methane, and we have some big findings with manure. So today, manure, it turns out that there's some simple things that can be done. In Denmark, it turns out that half of the methane is generated not in the storage tank, which is what's commonly thought, but in the barn. And the basic solution is to remove that manure not every 3 weeks, but basically every day or twice a day, which is what's done on pig farms in Sweden. And you can get rid of a lot of the methane there. Now, when it goes to the storage tank, Denmark has been investing huge amounts of money in biogas. And biogas basically works, but we found it's extraordinarily expensive in Denmark. And one reason is that in Denmark, the cool temperatures mean the methane emissions here aren't that high. And the cost of biogas in Denmark If it's more than $200 per ton of CO2 mitigation, if you use crops, it's may not even, they use 4% of the biomass as crops, which actually can all but eliminate any greenhouse gas reduction. If you tried to solve Denmark's greenhouse gas challenge with agriculture at this cost, it would be worth the value of all Danish agriculture. And to put this more clearly, Denmark is spending $250 million a year to deal with at most 2% of its emissions through biogas. But there are alternatives, which are to acidify the manure. There are some options of just adding a little bit of sulfate that look like it could be quite cost effective in reducing dramatically. There could even be some yield gains. It reduces ammonia emissions as well. So this is another technology. And here we had lots of cost estimates. Now, if you do all of this, we think we can reduce the production emissions by 80%. But then we also, and you can see this slides, the different things, but then you also need to produce more food in the same land. Now, some of that is increasing wheat yields. Some of that, and I'm going to go through the different measures. So wheat yields, just yield gains are important. They don't have to go to hysterical levels, but they can, we think Denmark can go from like 7.5 to 9, for example, in 30 years. This is a really exciting option, which is to replace some of the crops that are used, silage crops that are used, and instead to grow a high protein, high yielding grass, press that grass so that it releases its protein, use that protein to replace soybeans, use the remaining grass as a high quality fodder. And we think this is a real option to save a couple 100,000 hectares, build some soil carbon, and reduce nitrogen leaching. So this is a real option, we think, in Denmark. There's some basic things, which is these are things called fodder beets. They have twice the yield of wheat. They can be used as an animal feed. They are used in New Zealand. They have been used historically. They're practical ways to make it more easy. The benefit of this is you can save a lot of land. And then once we save all that land, this got nipped, we think we should restore a bunch of land. And that can mitigate the remaining up to 450,000 hectares, and that could mitigate the remaining emissions, even if Denmark produces 45% more food. So let me summarize. So this is all the things you could do there. Let me summarize our recommendation. Oh, and also, by the way, we also think we should be doing the same types of things in Latin America to make sure that you're boosting yields on existing land, in part through improved grazing that can absorb some of the soybeans. There are alternatives to soybeans that may have much higher yields, called Pangamia is one example, a oilseed that could have much higher yields, gain some carbon, fixes its own nitrogen. And we think there you can, it's not enough just to avoid buying soybeans from recently deforested land. It's important to make sure that your soybean consumption doesn't contribute to the global demand for land by increasing the efficiency of production and then combining that with projects that actually protect forests from conversion. So here's the key recommendations. The first and most important, or one of the two most important, they're equally important, is to have a much greater commitment to advancing these technologies. When the US wanted to go to the moon, or when Apple decided it wanted to build an iPhone, the technologies didn't exist to do that. And they didn't just say, okay, give us your research proposals. They created teams responsible for advancing, working with researchers around the world, but for advancing the technologies necessary to do that. In the case of the iPhone, to find the right materials, create the right screens, create the right software and batteries. The same thing needs to happen in agriculture. A team for enteric methane with a budget that it can work in real time. We show in the report over and over again promising ideas that have been around for many years that are getting tiny amounts of funding that need to advance in real time. And this should be working with farmers. So farmers should have test strips on their land across Denmark to test these things. And they're going to need continuous improvement. And the second recommendation we have is for what we call a social compact. And this is that even though Denmark can contribute to the world by producing more food for the world, that doesn't mean that Denmark should be an environmental sacrifice zone. And Denmark needs to be able to benefit from these yield gains too. And Denmark should not be responsible for all the greenhouse gas emissions. if agriculture does not mitigate its emissions in Denmark by 2040, agriculture could be 1.5% of the economy, but 80 or even 90% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So for Denmark to benefit, the increase in production should be tied explicitly to progress on mitigation and to restoring habitat. As you increase production, you restore these forests. There's only tiny amounts of native habitat in Denmark, and people in Denmark deserve to benefit from these gains. And we think it's important not to cherry pick. Obviously, some people are going to like the idea of producing more food in Denmark. Some people are going to like the idea of restoring more habitat. We think it's important that they proceed together, or these won't happen. That was my slide there. The last thing I'll say is this is more or less applicable to the rest of the world. Most of the technologies that we address would also be applicable in the US, Europe. The great value of Denmark. Denmark is only, it's a small country, it's an advanced agricultural economy. But in the time I worked on this report, the 18 months I worked on this report, the increased food production in India was greater than Denmark's entire agricultural sector. So what Denmark can really do is do what it did in the wind context. It showed the world how you could have cost-effective wind power. Agriculture is basically where the energy sector was 25 years ago. We have great ideas, but 25 years ago, no one had shown that wind, solar, batteries, these could actually replace fossil fuels realistically. We have the same great ideas for agriculture. We need to make the same kinds of commitments and investments. And that's the best way for Denmark to lead the world. And I'll stop it there.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Thank you.
Let me get rid of my screen.
Go ahead and unsave your screen.
Yeah.
Share your screen. Now we're going to turn over to our group of esteemed panelists. Each of them, I'm going to give 5 minutes to share thoughts and reflections on this report, applicability to Denmark, applicability to the rest of the world, depending upon who you are. First up, I bring to the stage Søren Søndergaard. Søren, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you again for giving me the opportunity to join you here today and to present my views on your report, Mr. Searching. I think it's been very interesting to listen to your thoughts. I guess climate change and increasing pressure on our national resources and the need of feeding the global population are among of the greatest challenges right now. And like you said, everything indicates that global consumption of food will increase rapidly in the coming years, since we must feed 10 billion people in 2050. And at the same time, a more climate-friendly and sustainable food production is needed. From our perspective, the Danish Agriculture and Food Council, we adopted a vision of working towards to be climate neutral in 2050. And to get input for that work, we approached you in 2019. And the reason being was that we wanted a benchmark of our climate efficiency compared to other food producing nations. And secondly, we wanted your recommendations on how we can fulfill this vision of becoming climate neutral in 2050, while at the same time, we want to preserve our food production in Denmark. And we see many positive elements in your report, like World Resource Institute, the global perspective and developing a more climate-friendly food production via products and technologies and know-how is also very central to us. And you conclude that the world food production, including in Denmark, of all types of food products, also the animal-based, must increase by 45% towards 2050. It's a quite amazing number, I think. But at the same time, we have to become more sustainable in our food production. I guess from our perspective, many of the proposed short-term climate measures are the right ones to ensure and increase in production and the green transformation of the agricultural production. And the idea of producing more, but in a more climate-friendly and sustainable way is fully backed by us. I guess producing more with less has for many years been the overall strategy in the Danish agriculture community. According to World Resource Institute, further research Further innovation and new technologies are needed, and that is needed if we are to achieve this long-term 2050 goal to being climate neutral. And this major R&D investment in the field of agriculture and food is also a proposal who is shared by us. We are also pleased that you conclude that climate efficient countries such as Denmark should continue to produce meat and dairy products. The consumption of meat and dairy products, despite an increase in consumption of plant-based food, is set to rise in the coming years, that's for sure. And I think it's very positive that from your perspective, it is better that Denmark's climate efficient meat and dairy production is maintained and further developed in a more climate friendly way, rather than leaving same production to less climate efficient countries. We are in the Danish agricultural community, however, not just planning to focus entirely on our meat and dairy production. We also see great prospects in the production of plant-based food, and we will invest even more in that in the coming years. I have to comment, of course, on your focus also on taking land aside, and we acknowledge, of course, that a certain amount of land will naturally find its way back to forest and nature, and we are already focusing on that today in different partnerships. For example, the peatlands you mentioned in your presentation earlier, Timothy. However, a conversion of 400,000 hectares into forest of good agricultural land will, from our perspective, challenge the overall climate ambition. It can be a bad idea for the climate if we are not able to increase production by 45% on the remaining areas, which I believe will be a challenge. The agricultural production, which we risk losing, will move to less climate efficient countries, and as a result, global greenhouse gas emission will increase. But I think we can agree on, all of us, that both 45% raise in production and 450,000 hectares are very large and very ambitious numbers, which no matter what will take many years to achieve and also include massive investments, like you said. But thanks again for the invitation. I think these were my remarks for the beginning. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you, Soren. Thank you for your reflections. And now I turn the floor over to Maria Rumer-Gerding from the Danish Society for Nature Conservation. Maria, your thoughts and reflections.
Thank you very much, Craig, and thank you very much for the opportunity to comment on your very interesting report and a very valuable contribution to an extremely important debate in Denmark right now about how the agricultural sector can contribute to our very ambitious 70% by 2030 climate goal. I am Maria Rumer-Gerding, as you said, president of the Danish Society for Nature Conservation. And we have been involved in the discussion of the climate footprint of Danish agriculture for many years, realizing that we won't achieve our climate or biodiversity goals without a dramatic change in how we grow our food and feed our animals. Our perspective is very Danish, and our vision is that Denmark should develop an agricultural system that can inspire other countries and regions in the world. We want Danish farming as an example to follow globally. Your global perspective is different, looking at Danish agriculture as an example of how to produce food intensively and still reduce the climate footprint dramatically. And we certainly see your point, even though it challenges some of our ideas. We believe that all regions should strive for a much higher degree of self-sufficiency, closing the gap between the amount of animals kept and the amount of feed produced. And then for Denmark, stopping the import of soy transported from the other side of the planet. And we also want to see a higher integration of nature and farming. Instead of dividing farmland up in highly productive arable land and then nature over here, we imagine the development of agroforestry methods adapted to the Danish climate and soils. And we want to support farming systems with many different crops in layers, annual, perennial, shrubs, trees, and in some cases animals. And we can produce food, feed, and fiber on the same land, and at the same time boost biodiversity and store carbon below and above the soil. And from our perspective, you have to develop this integration where the land delivers all these common goods. Our own policy papers from this year also aims at doubling the amount of land used to grow food for direct human consumption. We find it a little bit absurd that we only used a little bit over 10% of the farmland for this purpose. And there's also a very good business case, by the way, for doing this, looking at the international market for plant-based foods. The main challenge in your report for us is your proposal to maintain a large animal production. Our own policy paper states that the emission from cattle and pigs has to be halved by 2030. And we find it difficult to see how to do that without a substantial reduction in meat and milk production. We also have concerns about animal welfare and the use of antibiotics in the current way of keeping, particularly pigs. We basically want all Danish agriculture to be organic, which will reduce the very large amount of pigs we produce now. That being said, we completely agree that this huge production of milk and meat we have today must go hand in hand with a substantial conversion of farmland to nature. 450,000 hectares is a lot, and it would substantially change the way Denmark looks for the better. It would improve biodiversity, and it would, of course, reduce the climate footprint of Danish farming. And we must stress, which has also been Tim's point, that there must be no cherry picking. If you want to continue with the milk and meat production we have in Denmark today, it must be compensated by conversion of farmland to nature. And it has to start now. There has to be a mechanism in place to ensure that the peatlands are flooded and the forests are planted. Otherwise, we have to reduce not only the negative climate footprint of Danish agriculture, but also substantially reduce the amount of pigs and cows we have now. And to finish off, I also find it very helpful the way you think about separate production and consumptions. We have to find incentives to reduce the amount of milk and meat we consume here in Denmark. But we will, of course, for some time be a country with a substantial export of animal products. And we therefore totally agree that this needs to be accompanied by much bigger areas of land dedicated to nature. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria, for your perspectives. Much appreciated. And now we'll go from Denmark over to England for a bit of a global perspective from Charles Godfrey, a global expert on food systems. Charles, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Craig, and God eftermiddag, which I hope was roughly understandable to my Danish friends. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this really interesting conversation. I remember reading the WRI Global Report a few years back and thinking that it was a really important contribution to the debate about the future of the food system. And I remember at the time thinking, well, this is great, but it's very high level. When it will get very interesting is when it is applied to particular countries. So I'm particularly keen to see it applied to Denmark. And I'm looking forward to, and in fact, I've been talking to Tim about how it might be applied to other countries, and in particular, my own country, the UK. I guess there are a number of things I really like about this approach. And the first is about being honest in the accounting of greenhouse gas emissions. And some of the honesty in the accounting is relatively straightforward. So it just makes obvious sense that if you're feeding feed to your livestock that you've imported from abroad, then you should take account of the emissions from that. But I think we also have to be honest, and this is something which I think is more prevalent in my country than in Denmark. There are some completely unrealistic expectations of the amount of carbon that can be sequestered on farmland. Farmland can sequester carbon, but we have to be realistic about it. I think the real intellectual advance of both this report and the original WRI Global Report is the difficult bit of being honest, and that is accounting for what is going to be a major increase in demand for food over the next 50 years. You can argue about what the precise figure is going to be, but 45% I think is arguably about right. And I don't think that we in the rich world can ethically ignore that aspect. We could, if we wanted to, have agriculture in a country such as my country or Denmark, which is relatively low yield and has many nice things about it, but it would mean that much of that demand is pushed overseas. And in particular, when we're talking about livestock, as the report points out and Soren has underlined, the production of meat in Denmark at the moment is very carbon efficient. So I think that's a very interesting point there. I think, and the report doesn't go into great detail, I think there's also an economic aspect there that needs further investigation, because it's not enough to be a country that is very carbon efficient in livestock production, but you have to produce meat at a price point that can substitute for meat produced in those countries where it is less efficient. I very much like that the environment is treated as more than carbon, and in particular that biodiversity is taken into account from. I think the way that the conversation on biodiversity has moved over the last couple of years has been really interesting. You did not get big banks talking about biodiversity disclosure and biodiversity offsetting a few years back. You do now. And I think that argument, that discussion and that what it says for offsetting is really interesting. And so I think the report makes some real challenges for different communities. I think there is a challenge for Soren and a challenge for the industry, that what the WI report is recommending is not just business as usual, not just increasing production with marginal increases in greenhouse gas efficiency, is doing something really radical, something sufficiently radical, and it's going to be of great challenge to the farming community. But that is going to be necessary if we are serious about net zero carbon, net zero loss of biodiversity. I think if anything, the challenges to the environmental community, to Maria's community, will be even greater, because many of the things, and my background is in biodiversity, many of the things that we've argued for many years within the environment community have been done almost in a silo without thinking about the broader geopolitical issues, such as global demand for food and energy. And I don't think we can just consider ourselves in isolation. This is perhaps something for the questions, but I'm not convinced that increasing self-sufficiency in food is the right way to go. And then finally, for my community, for someone working at universities, there is a huge research challenge there to meet some of the very ambitious goals that the report outlines. And I very much like the suggestion there that we need task force, an international task force, and I say this as someone regretfully who's no longer in the European community, but we need international task force to see how we can approach some of these really important issues. Thanks so much, Craig.
Great, thank you, Charles. Let's bring everyone on stage now. So, because we're going to do a little bit of a discussion with Tim. I'm bringing Tim in as well, and the speakers here. Before we open a Q&A, audience, we will be coming to Q&A. Please continue putting questions in the Q&A chat box. I will get to you. But first, I thought we had some interesting perspectives here. Not everyone completely agrees. We didn't expect that, right? But that's the nature of agriculture. I wanted to just throw out a few questions here, and not everyone needs to answer every single question here, but the first one, it comes up a lot, is this question of plant-based meats. And I may want to turn to Tim on this one. Where does that factor into this analysis? Tim?
Yeah, I mean, in effect, we're assuming huge progress in plant-based meats because all our global projections assume we're going to manage to cut our beef consumption in wealthier countries by 50%. And actually, we're going to be able to moderate our consumption of meat and milk overall. The issue is we have to be realistic about what that can accomplish. As I said, 2/3 of the people, even in our projection, we need 45% more dairy and pork. that assumes that 2/3 of the people in the world eat no more than half of Western diets, 1/3 of Danish diets, and 1/4 of the people in the world eat only 1/4 of American diets and 1/6 of Danish diets. That's our baseline. That's our 45%. To achieve that baseline, we need plant-based meats. So we need to be realistic about what they can accomplish, and that's why, you know, that in the real world, we're going to need more. I mean, we are fantastically enthusiastic about shifting diets, but we don't want to bet the planet on unrealistic targets.
Reflections from others on this question? I mean, it comes up a lot. I'm preempting a few of the questions in the Q&A on plant-based meats. The impossible burgers of the planet. Charles, you get your hand up, good old-fashioned way. Yes.
I very much agree with Tim on that. We will see progress, especially in plant-based meats. One shouldn't assume that that can take all the heavy lifting. I think there is a big technological question when we go beyond processed meats into meats that actually look like cuts of meats that you see. We don't have the technology there. We will have it sometime, but whether it's 10, 20 or 50 years, to me, is still uncertain. But it is really interesting how the big meat companies, Danish Crown in Denmark, for example, are really beginning to invest in this area in a big way.
Others want to reflect on this one?
Well, I basically agree that we have to develop everything. It's not either an or, it's both an and. We can easily increase our production of plant-based food, and I really hope we will do that, because as a farmer, I would love to have that also as a first leg in my business, to have more plant-based product. We just need to be better also ourselves, of course, to develop the markets so that we can really grow in this area. And then at the same time, we can at least keep, and I know, Timothy, you say we need to increase by 45% of our dairy and milk production. I have to admit, I also think 45% is a big number, but I share, of course, the ambition, but we have many big numbers in this discussion.
Maria?
Let me just say one thing about that, if I can. You know, these are targets, and it would be unrealistic to me to say, well, you should restore 450,000 hectares of habitat today, and it would be unrealistic also to say, well, you should just produce 45% more food. These are targets to work toward. The central recommendation we have is kind of progress, and as you progress in one, you also progress in another. That's the basic idea.
Maria?
In our policy paper, we really hope to be able to develop the plant-based way for the Danish farming and the Danish agriculture, but not only the plant-based food as we know it today. That's why we're talking about agroforestry and combining the meat production with the plant production scenery. And I also hear from Søren and from all his farmers that they really want to look this perspective, as long as somebody wants to buy their products. So I hope that we can develop the plant-based food and also develop the technology for new food systems, you know, robots and completely new technology for this way of producing plant-based food for the world market, and especially in this region of Europe where we see, you know, many people who wants to buy this.
And Maria, I'm going to build up on a comment you made too, switching topics slightly. You talked about in one of your reports about, you know, import of soy, and because everyone in this call, right, understands the implications of soy and tropical deforestation, at least, you know, where soy is growing on the margin, etc., and maybe finding alternative feeds. Is that correct, Maria? That's one of the things that you were kind of pushing, right?
Yes, very much. I mean, we think that the Danish agriculture, Danish farming should have a strategy to stop importing soy, to be self-sufficient with food, with feed, and all the perspective of grass and proteins that Tim mentioned. We believe very strongly in developing this, but as soon as possible, we should stop importing feed and become completely self-sufficient with everything that's needed for the animal sector.
So we have a slightly different perspective on that.
Yeah, share your thing, because with the report does go into, that's where you're pressing the grasses. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? I'd love to hear from Søren on where he sees that technology and fit.
Yeah. So
Well,
that's, oh, go ahead, Soren, you go ahead first.
Timothy, sorry, you first.
Well, yeah, so there is this promising technology where you can grow grass and with high protein content and press it and get 20% of it becomes a replacement for soybeans. But we caution that if that just replaces other feeds, and you don't have a high enough yield on the grass, you could end up increasing your overall land use demand. So from our perspective, it's less where the food comes from than how much land do you require. The whole goal is to kind of reduce the land footprint. So we think it's also just as valuable to work, actually to work in Latin America. So one of the things we recommend is that Danish agriculture and the government together work with farmers in Latin America to assure that they also have an increase in output per hectare, and that is tied specifically to forest protection there. And there are lots of opportunities there, not just increasing soybean yields. I mentioned this alternatives to switch to tree-based oil seeds, and also to dramatically improve grazing efficiency through silvopastoral systems, for example, so that you can make sure that even if you expand your cropland a bit, you reduce your area of pasture, and therefore the total land area does not expand. So the basic thought is we don't think soybeans are the evil. We think the problem is global demand for land. And the whole goal, the essence of our report and our global report is to try to reduce that global demand for land by reducing consumption to the extent we can of milk and meat, frankly, beef above all, and by then producing more food on the same land, whatever type of food. Sorry, your turn.
But I think you have some very good points. I mean, we need a certain amount of protein in the world, both for human and for animals. And we just have to admit that soya is a very good protein, which is produced in a very efficient way. Of course, it has to be controlled, so we produce it in a way that we are not cutting down rainforests and things like that. We completely agree on that. But apart from that, on the other side, we also need to develop new proteins in Denmark. It would be great if the Danish agriculture could, be even more self-sufficient, or even replace some of the soya, of course, with protein we have developed ourselves. And even just in this weekend, actually, I visited a grass protein factory in Jutland, where we are at the moment having 2 up and running, where we are testing it at the moment to squeeze the protein out of the grass, and it looks very, very interesting. But it takes some big investments, and it takes time. But of course, I think in time from now, we will see more grass, also for grass protein. And grass is good in many ways. It's good for the carbon storage in the soil. It's good for the way we change the crops in our fields. So I think actually we all would like more grass. But I agree with you, Timothy. We have to be careful not to say that soya is evil, because it's actually a good product who can replace a lot of protein in the world.
I'm just one quick thing, if I can. Oh, sorry, Charles, you go.
Sorry, just very briefly. I was going to say, I do agree that one should be sort of doing the cost-benefit analysis a priori, and not sort of presuming soy is bad. And I'm sure you'll be the first to say this, one has to pay attention to the political economy. So one can control things quite accurately in one's own country. One has far less control of what's happening in soy in Brazil, or for example, palm oil in parts of Southeast Asia. So yes, in principle, but one has to be alive to the political economy realities.
Yeah. Let me just mention briefly, we in the best of all possible worlds, we could grow nothing but grass. We wouldn't have to grow annual crops at all. And technically it's possible. You can grow grass, you can convert it so it's as digestible as wheat or corn, and use that in place of crops and soy. The problem is right now it's just too expensive to actually do that additional conversion process. So it's the type of technology that we recommend exploring. We didn't think it was realistic enough to actually build into our 2050 scenario. But this is the lesson from this is, if we want more perennial agriculture, you've got to invent and develop it. I mean, we have literally thousands of years of wheat breeding. You don't replace that overnight without really, a lot of work.
Great. Yes, Maria.
We do not say soy is evil, but we are extremely concerned with what's going on in Brazil and other countries where we might get our soy from. And we're not saying we should change this overnight, but to set a goal that we should be self-sufficient and we should develop the grass technology and have as a goal, again, to have homegrown protein instead of this huge amount we get from the other side of the planet. So this is also about setting goals that we should and targets that we should work to accomplish, realizing that it's very difficult to control what's going on in countries where the whole political situation is problematic.
You put it politely there. I'm going to open the floor here to some Q&A questions. We started diving into some topics that the audience wants to have, so I'm going to dive into some of those here. And just launching off of just that last conversation about grass. You know, who knew? As a kid, I used to mow lawns, right? Who knew that grass actually was going to someday be worth a lot more than what I was cutting down? This one's for Dr. Godfrey. R&D, because this last conversation you talked about the importance of development, R&D. You know, Tim referred to the thousands of years of wheat, you know, breeding to get to where we are today. You know, the report highlights the constraints on R&D. So what's driving, what are the obstacles to increasing the levels of R&D in the types of solutions that are outlined in this report? Dr. Godfrey.
Well, two comments on that. One is a time lag, because if one goes back 20 or 30 years, then one of the biggest problems was overproduction of food in the rich world. And we weren't really thinking about global food security. So really from the 80s, 90s through to the beginning of this millennium, we weren't investing enough in research. And there is a good 15 or 20 year time lag. Now, I think that changed. And I think around about 2008, when we had the food price spike, then people were alerted that we were underinvesting in our agricultural technology. I think the second issue is that within agricultural research, there is still a sort of tendency to think about yields first and not a more complicated function of what one wants to achieve, which is yields plus efficiency, and including some of the things about breeding crops that then can be harvested by the very efficient robots that Maria talked about. So certainly within conversations among science research funders within the UK, it's trying to break down those silos between traditional agricultural breeders and environmental and people interested in environmental efficiency. And I think there's a lot to be done there. I think some of the examples that Tim talked about in denitrification and removing methane are really exciting, but we just need, again, as Tim said, quite a substantial new injection of funding into that research.
And could I just say one thing and then also pose this in the form of a question to Søren and Maria? So, you know, one of the points in our report is you can't just think of it as inviting research proposals. It has to be a much more, it's too slow, it's not comprehensive enough, it's not active enough. We need to have this back and forth, trying things, finding the best options, immediately proceeding them without waiting for another round of funding, you know, testing things. What is the way, what is the best way within the Denmark system to make that more active?
Well, partnerships and working together, I believe in. We have a very good tradition in Denmark of sharing knowledge with each other, both farmers between, but also farmers and organizations and universities. And we have a very good setup in our national research centers, SEGES, for example, where we have a partnership where the farmers are involved in a lot of this research. So we can actually show in real life what is working, what is not working, back on the factory, develop new ways and put it out again. So I think that is the way forward, that we need to get this a practical way of introducing the research into real life. And then I think we need to have partnerships. I mean, I think we have been very good 10, 20, 30 years ago in Denmark, that we were all sitting in each our hole and shouting a little bit at each other. I hope the next 5, 10 years we can be better to stand in front of each other and talk a little bit like we do today. Okay, of course we have some disagreements, but let's find out where we agree and then let's move ahead together.
At least that's the way we cooperate, Søren and I, and our two organizations, and we disagree about many things, but we also agree about many things. I think it's important that we cannot today pick the winners of the future. And I think we have to be open-minded, that there can be solutions, there can be technology, and there can be maybe also ancient knowledge, for instance, with agroforestry. And I think it's so important that the land has to give us several common goods, and to understand that the same land can give us food and feed and biodiversity and carbon storage at the very same area. And if we should succeed in these more diverse food systems, we need a huge technology development. But I think that the Danish case, for instance, with windmills, where it was a combination of political targets for solutions, support programs, private companies who cooperated in developing these solutions. I think this is really an example to follow. And I agree very much with Søren that we need all these different actors to go together and develop new technologies. But it's very important to me that we do not see the situation today as where we should end and just become more efficient. There can be solution technologies and diversity that waits ahead of us. So we have to be open-minded and be ready to think very much out of the box.
Could I respond very briefly
Yes,
to
please.
Maria on that? I think it's a very interesting thing, Maria, about we want multifunctional landscapes. And for some combinations of what landscapes produce, food and biodiversity and things, then doing everything in the same place makes absolute sense. In other places, it will be more efficient to have areas where biodiversity is the main thing you're after and food is the main thing you're after. And I don't think one should sort of start off with the answer that each bit of land can produce everything. It's actually a really interesting empirical question in what types of habits you really want to have. For example, low intensity agriculture and lots of biodiversity, land where you're rewilding, and land where you may concentrate on agriculture. And I think if we start off with that, we don't know what the answer is. And then for a particular set of outputs, a particular landscape, then try and empirically investigate it. That's one of the ways in which both the agricultural community and the environmental community can come together to work this out.
Yeah, to be very specific about that, so we were advised that the really dominant biodiversity need in Denmark is to restore some natural forests. So Denmark was basically forested area, and it has almost no natural forests. It has a small number of forests, and most of those are production forests. So that, from a biodiversity standpoint, that might be a priority. The peatlands, the organic lands that have to be restored, they will probably not generally be forested or heavily forested. And they are, you could imagine in some context, some grazing and things going on that land because of the types of communities that they might otherwise have. But our general recommendation is to for any land that isn't really producing a lot of food, to try to maximize its biodiversity so that we can get as much biodiversity as possible while still producing a lot of food.
Craig, may I ask a question?
Yes.
I'm just thinking a little bit about Timothy. We have also discussed this together, that we tend to look on Denmark as an island, you can say, and we want to reduce the carbon emission to zero in Denmark. But how about, and you also mentioned it a little bit earlier, Charles, about the international trade. I guess we also have to talk about that for centuries, we have been very good in Denmark to produce food for the world. We export food to the whole world, and the people like our products. And I guess that's the way it is, that each country has its speciality. And we happen to live in a place in the world where we just have a very good climate for producing food. How do you think about that? That in Denmark, maybe we are very good at producing food. In other countries, it can be a challenge to produce food. So I think that needs to be part of the discussion as well before we conclude how we should end this. But I know you have some opinions on that.
Yeah, well,
also.
I mean, I basically agree with that, and that's why we're in favor of Denmark maintaining more or less its share of global food production. It's already 90% of the pork is exported. But I just don't see, as Europe is not going to need a lot more food for itself, maybe less food, right? The population is going to be stable. I don't think many Europeans can eat any more milk and meat than they already do. Hopefully they'll eat less. And then the question is, what do you do with that land? Do you continue to produce a lot of milk and meat and help contribute to the world? But people in Europe are going to want to benefit from that. They're going to want more habitat. They're going to want lower emissions. And so I think that for people in Europe to accept the role of continuing to produce, have a fair amount of intensive agriculture, there has to be that reward. And so it's the combination. That's basically it. You could imagine a world where Denmark is entirely in the food production business and no habitat. But because of the way economies evolved, Denmark's now a wealthy country, and most of the economy is elsewhere. And people in Denmark, I think, over time, are going to want more habitat in Denmark. That's at least our assumption. So that's basically the thought. That was the theory behind the social contract. That as production increases, you restore some habitat, you mitigate emissions to make sure that the burden felt by the rest of Denmark, or not, put it another way, Denmark benefits and isn't burdened by that production.
It's a good point, and I guess also that's why we can have this discussion today, because we have the economy now that we can discuss to take out land. I mean, if my grandparents or great-grandparents, they listen to this discussion, they would think we were crazy. But today we are in a different position because we have had a big export for many, many years.
Yeah. If I could make two brief points.
Yeah,
one is that Tim and the WI report points out the need to produce more food to meet global demand. There is also a spatial component to that, and we're only going to be able to do that if we maximize what economists call a comparative advantage of different countries to produce things. So countries that are good at agriculture will have to contribute more than, say, Egypt, which has a population of about 90 million people at the moment, will be double that in 60 years and just can't produce that much food. Then on the other hand, if you think of biodiversity, and you can think of it in terms of natural capital and what we value in it, then yes, we do value, sitting here in Europe, we do value the Amazon, but we also value the biodiversity that we can have our own experience with. And I think that this sense of place is really important. So I cannot see any country wanting to concentrate purely on food and giving up on its biodiversity, even if it made narrow economic sense. The importance of place, the importance of exposure to biodiversity is just so important.
Maria?
I would just say that I completely agree with what Charles said earlier. In Denmark, we both need to, of course, as Tim also said, restore wild nature, wild places and habitat for nature. But we also need to think about the integration and to maximize and make these systems more efficient. Maybe it's not low output system, these agricultural system where we try to harvest in different layers, where we also have both biodiversity and actually carbon storage, which also have an economic value, of course, for society in the crisis that we face right now. So I just agree to think about this in different systems where we have wild nature, we have an integration, and we continue with the more intensive agriculture for now. And just for Tim, another concern we have, because we of course use our groundwater as drinking water, have you been looking at the pesticide use in Denmark if we implement your scenario?
That's one area we did not look that carefully at, but I would include, if we were to do another report, and this was already 170 pages, but we did look a lot at nitrogen, right? So the remedies that we're talking about would go a long way towards solving Denmark's nitrogen pollution problems, because all the things I'm talking about, the nitrogen use. Pesticides are important too, of course, very important. And there are a lot of real opportunities, I think, to reduce pesticide use over time as well. But that would be a separate report.
One thing I know in the food world is you can just keep on going on and on and on, right? There's always an additional dimension on there, right? But these are all, I want to get to, I mean, to me, this gets to the crux also of the first interventions of our panelists here is back to this, Tim, you termed it as the social contract or whatever, right? Of for nation states, in this case, Denmark was an example, but I presume it applies to many agricultural nations, right? Is the role of agriculture in contributing to food security for the planet, right? While also mitigating the environmental impacts linked with the domestic, in this case, the domestic habitat restoration opportunity. And it seems to me that if two different camps would value one over value one particular one, the deal to be made, right, is where both can come together and say, yes, we do realize you need to produce, protect, reduce, and restore. We need all four, right? What that combination looks like will vary from country to country, right? Egypt's, back to Dr. Godfrey, is not going to be very big on the produce, except for maybe rice in the Nile Delta, right? And they shouldn't expect to be big on that, right? But other nations who have that comparative advantage probably have a role to play in the produce. But at the same time, no one here is saying that you should take the pedal off of the reduce element too, right? We need to dramatically reduce food loss and waste. No one's against that, right? There does need to be some diet shift. It'll vary by country. Not every place needs to, there are many parts of the planet that actually probably need some more animal proteins for getting the various micronutrients, et cetera, right? But many places overconsume relative to health guidelines, et cetera. At the same time, where land does get liberated, we need to restore, right? In Denmark, it might be peat lands and forests for climate reasons, biodiversity. In other countries, it might be something else that's the element for restoration. But I guess to me, my key takeaway from the report is it's all four things are important, right? And every sector, industry, NGO, probably historically has favored one. That's how they've evolved. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just how they've evolved. But if we're going to achieve this massive change, and I think, Dr. Godfrey, I was pleased to hear your reaffirmation of the big insight for us at WRI doing the very first report was just how big the change is. And I agree with you, Dr. Godfrey. I don't think the world I know I didn't fully appreciate the scale of the business as usual, what the world would look like in 2050. People don't fully appreciate, I know I didn't, what 2.5 billion more people demand and moving up the income ladder, what that means in terms of the food system, the land system, the GHGs, the loss of biodiversity, et cetera. That is so big, it's hard for us, especially the five of us on the screen are probably in countries that went through the great transition 100, 150 years ago. It's happening now in lots of other places at the front lines, right? So we're kind of blind to it. To see the scale of that's what really shocked me, right, in the first report. And so really drives from the point of we probably don't have the time or the degrees of error to pick one of the four of the other. It's all four. It's produce, it is protect, it is reduce, and it is restore, right? The game is per country, per agricultural ecosystem of what's the relative balance, right? There's no one size fits all. That's why we almost need, reports like this per country, right? And then people can wrestle with it, right? But that's kind of where we need to go on this agenda. So with that, I want to thank all our panelists. A virtual round of applause for everyone here. I want to thank you for your time on this. I really appreciate the conversations. I'm glad that not everyone exactly agreed. That makes it more fun, right? And it realizes that we're actually hitting on something that's really, really important. But I also am enthused to see, I'm glad, Maria, you said about how you work very closely and engage. You may not agree with everything with LF, but you're in a dialogue with it. I think that's for the world. If other countries could replicate Denmark in that would be an advancement as well, right? So kudos to you and to both of you and both of your institutions, and best of luck going forward on this. I want to thank you all. I know we didn't.
Craig, can I say this? Yeah, I think we'll post some answers to some of the additional questions.
More questions. Yeah. There's more questions that we didn't get to. We're probably going to do a blog that kind of teases out some of the questions. We won't name who they are from, but there's some general themes that we didn't have time to get to today, like some things about assumptions in the modeling, et cetera, that we'll be able to answer, and other questions we'll answer in a blog on this one. The report and this webinar is on the WRI website. Thank you all for joining, and thank you for your questions. And again, a virtual round of applause for all of our speakers, and best of luck to Denmark.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much
Thank
indeed.
you.
Have a nice
Goodbye.
day.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.